I came home to find my workshop padlocked shut. Not locked by me. Not locked by anyone who had any right to touch it. Locked by my son-in-law, who had lived under my roof for 4 years without paying a single dollar in rent, and who apparently decided while I was away at my brother's funeral that the 12 by 24-foot workshop I had built with my own hands in my own backyard now belonged to him. There was a note taped to the door. A handwritten note, like I was a tenant who had violated some clause in a lease I never signed. It said, "Workshop is being converted to a home office. Your tools have been moved to the side yard. Please do not disturb the renovation. Please do not disturb the renovation." In my own backyard. On my own property. In the workshop I had spent 11 weekends building the year after my wife passed, because I needed something to do with my hands or I was going to fall apart completely. I stood there in the driveway with my overnight bag still on my shoulder, still wearing the same dark clothes I had worn to lower my brother into the ground 2 days before, and I read that note 3 times. Then I folded it carefully, put it in my shirt pocket, and walked inside to make a phone call. Not to my daughter, not yet. I called my attorney. My name is Dennis. I am 63 years old. I worked as an electrician for 31 years, ran my own small contracting business for the last 12 of those, and when I retired at 61, I owned my home outright, had a reasonable amount in savings, and had plans that involved exactly none of the chaos that was about to unfold in my life. My daughter, who I will call by her relationship to me because she is the only daughter I have, and I still love her even through everything that happened, moved back home 6 years ago after her first marriage ended. She was 31, heartbroken, and needed somewhere to land. I told her she could stay as long as she needed. I meant it. That is what fathers do. She stayed for a year, found her footing, started a new job in marketing at a mid-sized company downtown. She seemed happy. She seemed like herself again. Then she met her husband at a company event, and within 8 months they were engaged, and within 14 months they were married, and within 2 months of the wedding she came to me and asked if they could move in temporarily while they saved for a house. Temporarily. I want to be honest about something. I did not love the idea. I had been living alone for 4 years at that point, and I had made a kind of peace with the quiet. My wife had died of a stroke when my daughter was 26, and the grief of that had taken me a long time to work through. The workshop had been part of that. Cooking dinners slowly on Sunday afternoons had been part of that. Long drives on Saturday mornings with no destination had been part of that. I had built a life that fit me, and I knew instinctively that another person in the house, let alone 2 people, would change the shape of that life. But she was my daughter, and I told myself it would be temporary. 6 months, maybe a year. They were both working. They would save quickly. That was 4 years before I came home from my brother's funeral and found a padlock on my workshop door. Her husband, I will call him my son-in-law, because that is what he was. Legally, though the word feels complicated now, had a personality that I can only describe as aggressively confident. He was 34, worked in sales, and had an opinion about everything delivered with the certainty of someone who had never once been seriously wrong about anything. When he first moved in, he was cordial, even charming. He would ask about my contracting work, seemed genuinely interested, would come out to the workshop sometimes and watch me restore a piece of furniture or work on a cabinet I was building for a neighbor. But something shifted somewhere in the 2nd year. I am not sure exactly when. It was gradual. The way a foundation crack is gradual, you don't notice it until the wall starts leaning. He began making suggestions about the house. Small ones at first. The living room furniture was dated, maybe we should replace it. The kitchen could use updated hardware. The front landscaping looked tired. I would listen, nod, and do nothing, because it was my house and the furniture suited me. And I had planted the garden in the front myself over the course of 3 springs, and I was not going to rip it out because my son-in-law had developed opinions about curb appeal. Then the suggestions became something more. He started talking about the house as though it were a shared asset. We should think about refinancing. We could add real value if we opened up that back wall. The workshop footprint is wasted space. Dennis, honestly, you could put a proper guest suite back there and the property value alone. I told him clearly more than once that the house was mine, the workshop was mine, and I was not interested in renovations or refinancing or converting anything into anything. He would nod and smile in a way that made me feel like he had heard something entirely different from what I'd said. I should have pressed harder. I know that now. But she was happy, and I did not want to be the reason she wasn't. And so I kept drawing the line and then not enforcing it, which is not drawing a line at all. It is just pointing at the ground and hoping. I had been close to my brother, Robert. He was 68, 3 years older than me, and he had a heart condition that we had both known about for 2 years but had somehow collectively decided not to treat with the seriousness it deserved, the way families sometimes make agreements without words to not look directly at the thing that frightens them. He died on a Tuesday morning in March, at his home in Columbus, with his wife beside him. I drove to Columbus that same afternoon. I stayed for 4 days, helped with arrangements, sat with his wife through the long evenings, drove back home on a Saturday with my chest feeling hollowed out and my hands steadier on the wheel than the rest of me felt. When I pulled into my driveway, the first thing I noticed was that the side yard gate was open. I always kept it closed. The second thing I noticed was the padlock on the workshop. The third thing I noticed, once I had read the note and walked around to the side yard, was that my tools were not simply moved. They were stacked on a plastic tarp, uncovered, on the ground. My table saw, my router, 3 hand planes I had bought at an estate sale and spent 6 months restoring, a box of chisels my wife had given me for our 25th anniversary. All of it just sitting there, on the ground, under the open sky. In March, I stood there for a long moment. Then I went inside. My son-in-law was in the living room watching television. My daughter was in the kitchen. She heard me come in and called out that there was food if I was hungry. Her voice was careful. She knew I had just come from her uncle's funeral. She also, I realized in that moment, knew about the workshop. I set my bag down in the hallway. I walked to the doorway of the living room. He looked up. I said, "I need you to explain what happened to my workshop." He had the particular expression of someone who has prepared for a conversation and is confident in their position. He said the workshop had been sitting mostly unused, that he had been needing a proper office space for months because working from the bedroom was affecting his productivity, and that it made the most practical sense given the square footage situation. I said, "That is my property. You did not ask me." He said he had mentioned it to my daughter, and she had thought it was a reasonable solution, and he figured I wouldn't mind given that I had been traveling. I said, "You figured." He said, "Dennis, we need to be practical about space in this house. 4 years is a long time, and we have tried to be respectful, but honestly, the workshop—" I said, 4 years during which you have paid no rent." That landed differently than he expected. He shifted in his seat. He said they had understood the arrangement to be a family situation, not a rental situation. I said, "The arrangement was temporary. You have been here 4 years. My tools are on the ground outside in the cold, and you did not ask me." My daughter had come to the kitchen doorway. She said, "Dad, can we all just talk about this calmly?" I said, "I am calm. I want the padlock removed from my workshop door tonight. I want my tools moved back inside tonight. And I need both of you to sit down with me tomorrow morning because there are some things we need to get straight." My son-in-law started to say something about the renovation he had already started planning, about materials he had already priced. I said, "Remove the padlock tonight." I went to my room, closed the door, and called my attorney. Her name is Patricia, and I have used her for business matters for almost 15 years. She is not a dramatic person. She listened to what I told her without interruption, asked 3 or 4 practical questions about the property deed, whether there was any written agreement about their residency, whether any money had changed hands in any form. There was no written agreement. No money had changed hands. The deed was in my name alone. She said that what I was describing was a classic licensee situation. They were guests at my discretion, not tenants with legal protections, since no rent had ever been paid and no lease had ever been signed. She said I could ask them to leave and give them a reasonable notice period, and if they did not leave, I could pursue removal through the courts, but she expected they would leave before it came to that. She said I should document the condition of my tools and the workshop, take photographs, and send her a quick summary by email. I thanked her, took photographs of everything in the side yard, sent the email, and went to bed. I did not sleep particularly well. I kept thinking about my brother and about the chisels on the tarp, and about the fact that my daughter had known and said nothing when I called her from Columbus to say I was coming home. She had said, "Okay, Dad, drive safe." Nothing else. In the morning, I made coffee. I made enough for 3 people, because whatever else was happening, I was not going to be small about coffee. They came downstairs around 8:30. The padlock had been removed from the workshop I had checked at 6 when I woke up. The tools were still outside, but the door was open. We sat at the kitchen table. My son-in-law had his confident face on. My daughter looked like she had not slept either. I said, "I want to talk about a few things. First, I want to understand why my tools are still in the side yard." He said he had unlocked the door as I asked, but the tool situation was complicated because he had already begun moving some materials into the space. I said, "Remove them, today. Every tool goes back inside the workshop by this evening." He started to say. I said, "I am not negotiating that point. Those are my tools, and that is my workshop, and nothing about that has changed." My daughter said quietly, "He will, Dad. We will. Today." I said, "Thank you." I drank some coffee. Then I said, "I want to talk about the larger situation." I laid it out plainly. 4 years. No rent. No contribution to utilities, which I had never asked for but was noting now. No contribution to property taxes. 2 full-time salaries coming into this household, and not a single dollar directed towards saving for a home of their own, as best I could tell, because my daughter had once mentioned almost offhandedly, a year earlier, that they had wiped out their savings account, replacing his car and taking a vacation to Portugal. He said they had been managing some debt. I said, "What kind of debt takes 4 years and 2 salaries to manage when you have no rent, no mortgage, no utility bills?" He said, "That was their private financial business." I said, "It became my business when it became the reason you are still living in my house 4 years later." My daughter said his name quietly, a warning. He said, "Dennis, I understand you are grieving, and this is a hard time." I said, "Please do not use my brother's death as an explanation for why I am upset about finding a padlock on my workshop door. Those are 2 separate things." The table was very quiet for a moment. I said, "I love my daughter. I have been glad to have her here. I want to be honest about that. But this situation has gone on too long, and what happened with the workshop tells me that somewhere along the way, the understanding shifted, that you stopped feeling like guests and started feeling like something else. And I am not able to let that continue." He said, "Are you asking us to leave?" I said, "I am telling you that I need a firm plan and a firm date. I think 90 days is more than fair. That gives you 3 months to find a place, secure it, and move your things." My daughter's eyes filled. She said, "Dad," I said, 90 days, sweetheart. That is not me pushing you away. That is me saying this needs to change." My son-in-law sat back in his chair. He had the look of someone recalculating. Then he said something that I have thought about many times since, because it revealed more than he intended. He said, "I assumed when your wife passed that eventually this house would," and then he stopped. The kitchen was extremely quiet. I said, "Finish that sentence." He said, "I just meant that long-term, family situations." I said, "You assumed that eventually this house would become yours, or yours, and my daughter's. That is what you were going to say." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at the table. I said, "Did you know he thought that?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very softly, "He mentioned it once. I told him that wasn't something we should plan on." I said, "But you didn't tell me he had mentioned it." She didn't answer either. I excused myself from the table. I went out to the workshop, which still had a few cardboard boxes stacked inside the door that did not belong to me. I stood in there for a few minutes, among the tools and the sawdust smell and the particular quiet of a space I had built for myself, and I thought about my wife and my brother, and the way grief has a way of making you hold on to things too loosely, because the holding itself starts to feel dangerous. Then I went back inside and called Patricia again and asked her to draft a formal notice. Not because I thought it would come to that, because I wanted something real on paper, something that said clearly and without sentiment that the arrangement was ending and the date was set and the house was mine. She sent it over by email that afternoon. I printed 2 copies, signed both, and placed one on each of their nightstands while they were in the backyard, moving my tools back into the workshop, which they did, to their credit, every single item by 3 o'clock that afternoon. My son-in-law found his copy first. He came downstairs holding it like it was a foreign object. He said, "You had a lawyer write this?" I said, "I have a lawyer for most things. That is how I have gotten through 31 years of running a business without significant problems." He said this felt like an escalation. I said, "I asked you nicely for 4 years. I told you clearly this morning. The letter is not an escalation. It is a clarity." He said, "I think we need to talk about this more before you go putting legal documents in people's rooms." I said, "The document does not require your agreement. It is a notice. You have 90 days. He called my daughter in from wherever she was. She read her copy. She cried. Not dramatically, my daughter is not a dramatic person, which I have always been grateful for. She cried quietly. In that way she has had since she was small, where she tries to hold it in, and it comes out around the edges. She said, "You really want us out?" I said, "I want the situation to change. There is a difference." She said, "It doesn't feel like a difference." I said, "I know, but it is." Her husband spent the next 3 days in a particular kind of cold fury that he tried to disguise as calm. He would come downstairs, make coffee without offering any to me, sit at the kitchen table with his laptop, and have loud phone calls that were clearly for my benefit calls to real estate agents that emphasized their budget in a way that seemed designed to make me feel guilty, calls to what sounded like his parents where he described the situation in terms that I gathered cast me as something between unreasonable and unwell. On the 4th day, his mother called my cell phone. I did not know she had my number. I answered because I did not recognize the number and thought it might be something related to my brother's estate. She introduced herself. She said she understood there had been some tension at the house and she wanted to reach out because she felt families should work things out without lawyers. I said respectfully that her son had been living in my home for 4 years without paying rent and had put a padlock on my workshop without asking me, and that I had given them 90 days' notice, which was more than fair, and that I was not sure what she felt needed to be worked out beyond that. She said that her son had told her I had been going through some difficult times emotionally, and that sometimes grief affected people's decision-making. I said, "I see." I said it politely, and I said it once, and then I told her I had to go. I had, in fact, nowhere to be. But the conversation was over. I told Patricia about the call. She said it was not unusual and not consequential. She said to document it and move on. I documented it and moved on. The weeks that followed had a particular texture. Functional but charged. Meals were mostly separate. Pleasantries in the hallway were brief. My daughter and I had coffee together twice, in the early morning before her husband was awake, and those conversations were among the most honest we had had in years. She told me she was embarrassed about the workshop. She said she had told him it was a bad idea, and he had done it anyway, and she had not pushed hard enough. She said she was sorry. I said I appreciated that. I said I was not angry at her. I said I was, if I was being honest, a little sad, not about any of this specifically, but about the longer pattern of it, the way I had let things slide for 4 years, because I wanted peace, and how peace pursued that way eventually becomes a different problem. She said, "I think we have some things to work on." She meant her and her husband. I said, "I think that is probably true. I meant me too." Around week 5, his attitude shifted. The cold fury became something more subdued. I think the reality of the housing market had made an impression. He came to me one evening while I was in the workshop and stood in the doorway for a moment before saying he wanted to apologize for the workshop situation. I looked at him. He said I overstepped. I knew it when I did it, honestly. I had convinced myself it was practical and that you would see it that way. I said, "Did it occur to you to ask me?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I thought you might say no." That was, at least, honest. I said, "I would have said no." He almost smiled. Not quite. He said they had found an apartment, a 2-bedroom in a neighborhood about 20 minutes away. They were planning to sign the lease by the end of the month, move in 6 weeks after that. I said, "That is good news." He said, "I know this didn't go the way any of us wanted." I said, "No, but it is going the right direction now." He nodded. He looked around the workshop for a moment at the workbench, the tools organized on their pegboard, the half-finished cabinet in the corner that I had started working on again the day after I got back from Columbus. He said, "You do good work in here." I said, "Thank you." He left. It was not a resolution exactly. It was not a reconciliation. It was two people acknowledging that the space between them had some real things in it, and that at least one of those things had been named. The moving day came on a Saturday in late April. They had hired movers, 2 young men with a truck, and the process took most of the morning. I stayed out of the way, mostly in the workshop, sanding the cabinet doors I had been working on. I could hear the footsteps above me, the thump of boxes, the particular sound of furniture being angled through doorways. At some point, my daughter came out to the workshop. She stood in the doorway, which seemed to be a theme for that spring people standing in that doorway, and she said, "We're almost done." I set down the sanding block. I said, "How are you feeling?" She said, "Scared." "Excited." "Mostly scared." I said, "That is the right amount of scared for something that is the right decision." She came over and hugged me. My daughter has always hugged the same way. She cried, trying to contain it, and it coming through anyway. She said into my shoulder, "I'm sorry it took this long." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm going to be better at this, at boundaries, and talking to you, not letting things pile up." I said, "Me too." She pulled back and looked at the cabinet. She said, "That's beautiful, Dad." I said, "It's for the hallway. I've been working on it since February." She touched the edge of one of the doors. She said, "Mom would have liked it." I said, "I think so too." The truck was gone by 2 in the afternoon. I walked through the house slowly after they left, not sadly, but the way you walk through a space when you are recalibrating to it. The rooms were the same. My furniture, my pictures, my slight disorder of books stacked on the coffee table. The guest room, which had been their room, was empty, except for the bed frame, which had been mine anyway, and a small mirror they had left behind. I opened the workshop and stood in the middle of it for a while. It smelled like sawdust and linseed oil, and faintly of the WD-40 I had used on the hinges the week before. The tools were all where they belonged. The cabinet was coming along. I thought about my wife. I thought about my brother. I thought about the way love is not actually demonstrated by the absence of boundaries, but by the honesty of them. That the kindest thing is sometimes the thing that costs you the temporary comfort of being liked, and that comfort, held too tightly, has a way of becoming something that looks like love but functions more like avoidance. My daughter called that evening, from the new apartment. She said the movers had scratched a dresser, but otherwise it had gone well. She said the apartment was smaller than she remembered from the showing, but that it was theirs and it felt different. I said, "Different? How?" She said, "Like something we actually did, not something we were given." I said that was exactly it. She said her husband was assembling a bookcase and was already frustrated with the instructions, and she had to go rescue him. I said, "Give him my regards." She laughed. She said, "Dad." I said, "Tell him I mean it." She said she would. She said she'd come for dinner next week. I said I'd cook. After we hung up, I went back to the workshop and worked until almost 9. The cabinet doors just about ready to hang. The light in there at that hour is yellow and warm from the single overhead fixture, and in that light, with the smell of the wood and the quiet of the house and the coming summer audible in the crickets outside, the space felt exactly like what I had built it to be. A place to be steady in, a place to do good work in. Mine. There are things I could have done differently. I could have had the direct conversation with both of them at the end of year 1, before patterns had time to harden. I could have put something in writing from the beginning, even something informal, something that said, "This is temporary. Here is what temporary means." I could have spoken up each time he made a suggestion about the house and taken it as seriously as it turned out to deserve, instead of brushing it off and letting it accumulate. I am 63 years old. I have made a lot of decisions in my life, good and bad, and I have learned to hold them with a certain even-handedness, not excusing the mistakes, but not catastrophizing them either. This was not my finest chapter. It was not my worst. It was a chapter in which I let myself be a certain kind of fool because I loved someone and wanted her to be comfortable, and in which I eventually stopped being that kind of fool because the cost of it had become clear. What I know now, that I did not know with the same clarity before, is this: the house being mine is not a selfish fact. It is simply a fact. The workshop is mine. The tools are mine. The hallway cabinet with the hand-cut dovetails and the linseed oil finish is mine. These things are mine, not because I am grasping, but because I made them, or earned them, or built them out of grief in 11 weekends the year my wife died. And the people I love are not served by my pretending otherwise. My son-in-law and I have reached something that is not yet friendship, but is no longer hostility. We have had dinner at their apartment twice. He is still aggressively confident, and probably always will be, but he helped me carry the cabinet in from my truck when I finished it, and I showed him how the dovetails fit, and he said, genuinely, that he had never seen joinery done by hand before. I told him I could show him sometime if he wanted. He said he might take me up on that. My daughter seems lighter. That is the word I keep coming back to. She seems like a person who has put something down that she had been carrying for a long time without quite knowing it. And I have my workshop back. That is enough. More than enough. In the yellow light, with the wood and the quiet, it is more than enough.